Welcome, Jennie Stephens, to the Eco Interviews. We're very excited to have you. How are you doing today?
I'm doing well. Doing well. Thank you for
Perfect.
having me.
Yeah, Jennie Stephens is from the Center of Heirs Property Preservation. It'd be great if you could introduce yourself and tell us about the Heirs Property Center.
Okay. Well, as Fiona said, I have the privilege of being the CEO here at the Center for Heirs Property Preservation. We're a nonprofit organization that was created in 2005. If you may not know what heirs property is, it's land that has been passed down without a will. So the result is the family ends up owning it jointly and have to make decisions jointly for it really to be used to be maximized. And so when we started in 2005, it was really providing that legal education and those direct legal services to resolve any issues to the title. So let me give you an example. People who own heirs property, they can't get a mortgage because there's not clear marketable title, okay? They cannot, or they have very limited access to conservation programs or housing rehabilitation funds from the state or the federal government. And, you know, now the Gulf has just gone through a hurricane. And so people who own heirs property it's difficult for them to benefit from FEMA funds. So there's a lot of can'ts, even though land is considered a major asset. For heirs property owners, they see it more as a liability than they do as an asset. So here at this organization, we see ourselves as a tool that landowners can use to resolve any title issues and unlock the potential in their family land.
Okay. Yeah. So when I first heard of heirs property, it's a term that's new to me. So, you know, I Googled it and it very much comes up for South Carolina. Is it unique to South Carolina, or is this something that happens across the country or maybe even across the world?
Actually, it is across the world. So it's not just a South Carolina thing, but in the South, it is seen to have resulted from after the Civil War, where African Americans could acquired land, either worked for it or paid for it outright, where one, there weren't a lot of lawyers, so they didn't know who to approach on how to pass this asset down to their loved ones. There's also an article that was written by, sorry, having a senior moment. The title of the article is torn from the land, where it talks about how African Americans lost a lot of land after the turn of after the Civil War. And so, one, if there were lawyers, they didn't trust them, and two, so yeah, they maybe couldn't afford them. And then the result was that basically they created a way to pass down this asset to their family. But the problem with that is usually it was orally passed down. You know, they say, hey, Sue, you have this piece by the road. Jim, you have the piece, you know, on the corner. But we all know if it's not in writing, it's not valid. So I just gave you a little snapshot of how it looks in the South, but really it's not an African American issue only. To me, it's a low income issue. Okay. So if you were to go to the Appalachian area, the skin color of the landowner would change, but it would be the same issue. Mm-hmm. It's also known among Native Americans, except it's called fractionated land for them. So it's also in the colonias, you know, so basically low income folk do not sit around the dinner table and talk about estate planning.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And you have touched a little bit on it, and it's interesting. I'm interviewing different people because I have become aware of what we're calling colonial settlers and the negative impacts. And right. And so I'm hearing more about this in the South. I'm going to speak to a Native American woman later this week about similar issues. And then yesterday I interviewed a gentleman from Indonesia talking about the
Ah,
indigenous people not
right,
being able to claim their land. Exactly the same thing. It's not
right.
that written title. Can you speak to this issue in South Carolina and remind us of the history of post-Civil War Black land ownership?
So actually, I forgot my one little disclaimer I usually give, and just want to remind the audience that I'm not an attorney, so I'm not providing you any legal advice, but just the broad overview about this issue. So I think it was USDA, they have the agricultural census, and I think African American, and it was in relation to farmers. So I don't know if it's just South Carolina, but just from that perspective, right after the Civil War, African Americans owned about 15 million acres of land. Then in I think it's the early 21st century, that was down to about 3 million acres. And so some of the researchers have attributed that loss to the policy that USDA had with African American farmers, heirs property, because, if you don't pass it down, heirs property is also a very vulnerable form of land ownership, because literally um, one person can sell their interest. So if you want to think about it, think about heirs property as a pie. You might have started out with 4 slices of pie because you've had a spouse and 3 children who's the heir of the person who's on the deed. But however, they continue to not have an estate plan or not probate that loved one's estate. So the pie doesn't get any bigger, the slices do. And so it makes it hard to really to utilize the land. You asked me a question. So yes, so a lot of land was lost because people either didn't pay the property taxes. That's the other thing about heirs property. Who does pay the property tax? Really, all of the owners are responsible for it. But what we've discovered, there's usually a couple of responsible folk who are staying on top of it and making sure the bill is paid. So there are several reasons why land has been lost among African Americans.
It must be nearly impossible to get all family members of a large extended family to pay the taxes.
Well, we all get along with all of our family members, don't we?
Yeah, exactly.
I know, right? So, and if you think about it too, in some cases, some family members left the South, and we always joke that we tease the Philly and the New York people, but you're in essence asking people to make a business decision, and they don't know each other. Maybe except for the dropping in for a family reunion, and in some cases, not even that. So how do you want, what do you expect to happen when you ask 2 strangers to make a business decision?
Yeah. In one of your presentations, I watched your TEDx talk that you did in Charleston, and you talked about these families being land rich but cash poor. Can you elaborate on that?
So it goes back to, as I said, there are a lot of can'ts associated with heirs property, but typically land is one of the major assets that people use to build wealth, right? But if you don't have clear marketable title, then you have land, but you don't have the cash to either resolve the title issue or to, as I said, maximize the use. It could be through ag, it could be through leasing the land, because you don't have clear title. One of the things that we operate a sustainable forestry program here. So let's say people have a certain amount of acreage and they haven't managed it well, but they have the timber cut. Typically, they're not going to get the best price for that timber being cut, because the timber buyer, of course, is going to make sure that he or she is protected from, not knowing the heir. So it makes it, so that's why it's land rich but cash poor. You really cannot tap into the equity. That's the better way of putting it, in that asset.
I've read.
I've heard one researcher call it dead capital. That's how they described it.
Right. It's an asset that's not working in your favor at that point. I've seen some really sad stories of people who unfortunately were taken advantage of due to the shaky ground that Heirs Property left them on. Is there one of these stories that you'd be okay to share with us to kind of crystallize it in our heads?
And it's interesting that you said you watched my TEDx talk. And so I use an example. That scenario happened before the center was established, where really, I believe it goes back to lack of knowledge. People don't understand what it means to own land as heirs property. So this particular gentleman, and it was the Rivers family, that's who I referred to, and it was on the front page of our regional paper, where because the sister had approached her brother and saying, basically, buy me out. And he felt that she had no right to ownership because she didn't live there. Long story short, it was a really not so nice case. The family ended up being forced off the property. And when I say the family, not only was Mr. Rivers staying there on this land, and basically you could stand on this man's backyard and look out on the marsh, and you could see the interstate. So just kind of prefacing how valuable this land is. And so when they went to court, and because they could not agree, because that's the key point, what we do here, though, is we bring about agreement before the case goes to court. So in essence, we're saying to the judge, hey, we've identified all the heirs. Here's how they want this to happen. But this case didn't do that because they weren't in agreement. They went to court, and ultimately the judge said, it's easy to divide money versus land. And so the judge forced a sale, and a group of developers bought it for, I think, about $500,000. However, once they cleared the title, they made, I think, over $2 million on that property. So the cash, or the wealth, whichever word you want to use, that was in that land that belonged to that family had been lost because they didn't understand what it meant to either own the land as heirs property or to how to resolve it in a favorable way.
Right. It sounds like people in a vulnerable position be taken advantage of, not coming to the table possibly with the best hand, right? If we're in negotiations with someone trying to buy your land.
Correct. Even though the laws have changed now, that would have made it a little different and they could have gotten a higher price, but back then that law was not in place.
Okay, so what laws have they put in place now to prevent that from happening?
It's the Uniform Partition Heirs Property Act, but for South Carolina, it's called the Senator Clementi Pinckney Heirs Property Act, if I'm not mistaken, where it would have required that the land be put up for a traditional real estate sale versus an auction, because that's what happened. And so that family could have gotten a better price for the property. And it also, that law looks at, what is the word? It's not intrinsic value, but the value that the family associates with that land versus the economic value. So there are a couple of things that could have made the outcome of that case differently if it was tried at 20 years later.
Mm-hmm. That's sad. In a previous guest of ours, Queen Quet, who is the chiefess of the Gullah Geechee people who are down the Low Country.
Right.
Speaking to her, that sounds like a community that has been very much affected by heirs property. Can you talk about the difficulties faced by those? Well, we've spoken a little bit about the difficulty of those with in an heirs property situation, but in particular, especially with the Low Country, there's a lot of this coming up as it relates to gentrification.
Yeah.
Can you talk to us about that?
It's interesting, when the descendants of the enslaved folk acquired land, it was often the less productive land. And so, back then it was not of value. But it's interesting now, I like to say everybody and their mama wants to live next to the marsh or to the water. So what wasn't valuable back then now is. And, you know, we're like any city or town where you're blessed that there are attractions that bring folk from outside to your area, but that also can be seen as a curse, because once those people arrive here, they often want to change the things that they loved and which brought them to this community. So yes, we live in a region where there is, you know, home to Boeing, home to Volvo, home to Mercedes. It's constantly growing, and you know, you have to accommodate the growth to support those industries. And unfortunately, the individuals who don't have clear title or who don't have a louder voice, I'll put it that way, oftentimes their communities are changed, and then ultimately they're gone. They no longer live there, and the flavor, the culture, the history that made that community what it was is now gone.
Mm-hmm. I think I was just reading Farming While Black by Leah Penniman, and she talked a little bit about gentrification. Just as you mentioned, it was areas that were previously less productive or undesirable, but then the hard work of those people there have changed that, and now other people want to come in. And one of the articles I read is talking about losing some of this African-American history and culture in the process, because there's these developments being built right next to, say, a historic AME church or graveyard. Correct. Can you talk about that?
So we haven't had a lot of exposure to that, but we have heard how when developers acquire a property where there was or is an African-American cemetery, of course it becomes a gated community, and then that means that those families have to have permission to go see their loved ones. And in some cases, it's not been as nice, and they basically move them to another spot. So, it just depends. I don't know what else to say about that. So
it's that's incredibly, I can't imagine how not even just unpleasant, just quite traumatic to not be able to visit something that is sacred to your family and your community.
Right. And so with our Gullah history project that we have through a grant from the South Carolina Department of Archives, we've made 9 grants to communities, and I think about a third of those communities are looking at restoring cemeteries and actually making them a spot that people want to visit. And I don't mean just the family, but it's amazing what you can learn when I know it sounds a little morbid, but when you walk through a cemetery and how they're discovering, they had people who were in the World War I or World War II, and the fact that they didn't know it. There really is a lot of history in those cemeteries.
Do you want to talk about that grant program a little bit more and tell us the sort of work that's being done to preserve this history?
So you never really hear us kind of talk about gentrification. What we're saying, though, is we want to make sure that folk learn about the culture and history that occurred in the communities, because once you know it, then you can, what's the word I'm looking for? If you can emphasize that, then at least people know that the history and culture, so it's less likely to be gentrified if possible. So our route has been, helping everyone, the broader community, understand the history and culture associated with these communities, and of course resolving heirs property. So to us, that is a way of preventing gentrification.
Mm-hmm.
And making sure the landowners are also aware of how planning and zoning, how those decisions are made, so that they can also be involved in that process.
Mm-hmm. I think there's a Richard Louv quote in regards to the earth: if you cannot love what you cannot know, and you cannot know what you cannot see. And I feel like that harkens to that. You can't respect or understand what you're on unless you understand the history that you're on. So hopefully these preservation initiatives are going to bring a deeper understanding, and also a consideration when it comes to residential development, that We don't
Well,
continue to make the mistakes that we've made for centuries in this country when it
right.
comes to whitewashing everything.
Your term, not
Yeah,
mine.
I said it. I'm sorry.
But I also want to say, though, that it is, and I alluded to this, or I said it actually in my op-ed, is the fact that Charleston is going to be home to the International African American Museum, and African Americans have made, there's not a lot of documentation of the contributions from African Americans in history books that children get to know, but yet the communities that help make Charleston what it is now they're literally being erased because of development.
Exactly. We don't want that to be in the museum.
Yeah, so
Excuse me.
why do you want to protect the history and culture in the museum, but you don't care anything about the actual communities or the people who help make that history happen?
It's similar with the conservation movement of, let's conserve this beautiful land, but then kick the people off the land in the process.
Well, and I've knocked heads a couple of times with conservation folk, and I've always posed the question: you're conserving or preserving it for whom?
Mm-hmm. These are all questions that are coming up a lot right now, and rightfully so. It needs to be brought back up. The heirs property issues certainly come up when we're talking about selling land. That's a lot of the stuff that we're talking about. But you mentioned just briefly that the heirs property preservation also educates people on how to use their land to work for them. So turning that asset into an actual asset,
Right.
and in particular through sustainable land use with forestry. Can you tell us about this?
Sure. The center, prior to 2013, as I said earlier, the center's focus really was on legal education and delivering direct legal services. But a couple of funders said, well, hey, if that's all you guys are ever going to do, we may not fund you in the future. And so we started thinking about other alternatives. Now, of course, it's hard to resolve title to heirs property, but it's a valid question. Once people's titles are cleared, what are they now doing with the land? And so we had the opportunity to create a partnership with our state forestry commission, with our local natural resource, a division of USDA, two of them, Natural Resource Conservation Service and the Farm Service Agency, and conservation groups and the Wildlife Federation. Literally, we sat around the table, and when the U.S. Endowment for Forestry and Communities came out with this a grant application or grant notice and saying, we have the forestry folk saying, look, we can't serve this group of folk because they don't have clear title. And you had the USDA folks saying, well, one, they either don't know we exist or they're not coming to our office. So it was really a great match to bring all of us together to see how we could work together. And basically, I like to use the term to have an opportunity for families to see that their land can work for them rather than them working for the land. So so we started our sustainable forestry program in 2013. We started out with one forester on staff. I think we're up to 5 now, and we serve a third of the state, both with our forestry services and our legal services, because what we discovered is we thought that more folk would be interested in the sustainable forestry side, but when our forester would go out and conduct presentations, inevitably there would be someone say, but don't y'all work with heirs property? Because we discovered that forestry became the carrot to have heirs property owners deal with issues. Now that they saw there was some potential money, maybe Aunt Sue or Uncle Bob wasn't that bad, and I might try to have a conversation with them. So it was a nice marriage of the two. And it's also been proven that individuals who are making money from their land, they're more likely to have a will or a succession plan, and they're less likely to sell it. So when you look at it, we stepped into the field, we literally stepped into the conservation arena, which we weren't really ever thinking about, because even though our primary focus has always been land, we always see the people first. So we always talk about families. So we never saw ourselves initially as a conservation group, but lo and behold, that's really what we do.
So, so you have the forestry program. Is there any interest in agriculture?
Traditional ag.
Mm-hmm.
So some of our families actually do traditional ag, and we have agroforestry, which is that combo. But we want to make sure that we're perfecting certain areas. We don't want to become all things to all people, and hence why we partner with other groups who may be providing that traditional ag piece.
Excellent. Yeah. Like, as I mentioned, tomorrow I'm going to speak to someone who's actually in that Northeast. Oh, goodness, the acronym. Northeast land, Northeast. I don't know. It's basically a land trust for people of color.
Okay.
And so they're trying to expand it.
And it's the Northeast is not the Black Family Land Trust.
I haven't had a chance to speak to them yet, but the connections up in the Northeast. I know that they have. They do serve just the Northeast, but they're starting to mark on a U.S. map people of color who are farming the land. And I noticed that there were 3 in South Carolina, and that's.
I'd love to know that name of that organization. When you do,
100%. I will. Okay. I will get it for you, because that's and we'll talk about this in a different interview. But that's another part of African Americans losing their land, unfortunately, is that and you mentioned the USDA, something like 20% of farmland in 1890 was owned by Black people, and now it's less than 1%, which is just land theft to the extreme. Such a shame.
Right. Well, and so on top of that, you have the issue of slavery and how African Americans, even though organic farming is the quote unquote new thing, as formerly enslaved folk, or even after that, African Americans were practicing what was organic farming before there was a name. But because of the stigma, it is hard to get African Americans to return, or as I was talking on a committee earlier this morning, is that, we need to reconnect with the land, not see the negative aspect of it, but the fact that, it is positive. You're working your own land, so there's a difference.
Yes, that's exactly what the book I'm reading right now is, Farming While Black, and talking about the generational trauma associated with Black people working the land. And the organization I'm speaking to tomorrow is a Northeast Farmers of Color Land Trust.
Okay.
And I will certainly connect you or send you an email with that information as well. Okay, do you have an idea of how many people, families, or acres of land are affected by heirs property?
So we have what we call a guesstimate, because really for you to clearly know what land is heirs property and what isn't, you would need to have a title search, and you would need to know the names of all heirs. So that would defeat the purpose, because you would just resolve the title if you knew that. So in our, we're currently serving 18 counties, and in that 18 counties, we are estimating that there is at least 108,000 acres of heirs property. So we've been resolving heirs property since 2005, and we're up to 274 titles with land valued at $16.3 million. And back in the day, I came up with an average of about $7,000 per acre. Now, of course, a lot of that land was in Charleston County, which is going to skew the value. But, if you took that 108,000 and multiplied it by 7,000, I think it was almost $1 billion. And that's tax assessed value. That's not what the market rate is. That's tax assessed value. So can you imagine, if we could, our philosophy is, if we could unlock the potential, resolve the title issues to that land, then folk who are low income or have been in poverty for a while, they really have the means to help themselves move out of poverty. I know you've probably heard about the corridor of shame, which is around Interstate 95, where several of the counties, there's been people greater than 20% of poverty for several years. Congressman Clyburn is the one coined it the I-95 corridor, and how the majority of our landowners live in that corridor. And so our point is, wow, if we can connect these tools to these landowners, look at the difference that we can have, not just on them now, but generations to come.
You mentioned a lot of this is in Charleston County, and then as you just mentioned that corridor, I didn't know it was called the Corridor of Shame, but I have certainly driven through it from Charleston up to where I live in Lugoff. Like there's, it is, you know, it's different when you drive through there.
It's Interstate 95, so not 26, but Interstate 95. And if you Google Corridor of Shame, that's in relation to the educational system in those low-income areas. But that corridor of shame happens to overlap what Congressman Clyburn has called the I-95 corridor, and how there is as I said, a greater percentage of people or families who've been in poverty for several years.
And so that was my next question: is you serve 18 counties in South Carolina, excluding Charleston County. What are these counties that are the next up and coming heirs property hotspot?
Well, then, so I thought you were going to ask me to name all 18. I was like, okay, I got to do alphabet, and I may forget some. But so definitely Berkeley, Dorchester, because that right now is the hub for Volvo and Mercedes. So you have that area. There is supposedly to be creation of what is the word? Basically creating industry around the 26 and 20 intersection of the interstate, which would be Orangeburg County. So yeah, so off the top of our heads, or my head, those would probably be the three. And the other one I would add would be Jasper County, because the widening of the port for Jasper and Savannah. So you've got these traditionally poorer counties, except for Berkeley and Dorchester, they're not as poor. But if you're looking at Orangeburg and Jasper, they definitely are. So yeah.
So what do you envision for the future of heirs property? Like for the heirs property center, there might not be an end goal, but what would be let's forecast 20 years ahead or 50 years ahead, and what are we looking at?
If it were a perfect world, what we'd like to see is that everybody would have a will, and their families would know where the will is located and what to do once the person dies. The interesting piece about heirs property is literally it only takes 10 years for it to become, you can resolve title to something, somebody can die, have a will, they pass it on to their children, and if the children don't probate the will, so in another 10 years, guess what? Even though you've resolved that issue, it's occurred again. So to answer your question, in a perfect world, everybody would remember all the legal education we provided to them and would have a will, and families would know what to do with it. But we know this is not a perfect world. I'd like to say we want to work ourselves out of business, but I don't know if that's going to be the case. But what we've also discovered in those cases I told you that we've resolved over our 15 years is 2/3 of them have been around probate, which our attorneys look at as it's prevention. So if we can get people to do that aspect, to probate the estate, then the tougher one is the quiet title, where you have multiple generations and people may not know each other. But for probate, it's not the same. So if we can focus on getting people, even if they can resolve the issue within 10 years, then we're still in that prevention bucket. And so ultimately, we know we can't stop it, but if we can focus on what would prevent I like to say, prevent the growth and prevent the loss of heirs property. So, there's two sides to that.
I didn't even think about the fact it could be heirs property title resolved, and then in a generation or two, it can go back into an heirs property situation.
Correct.
Um,
And in prime example, I became an ancestry.com geek a couple of years back, and I was looking at my family, and one of my great grandfathers, I don't know how far back, but I went and I looked up his will in the probate court in that county. This gentleman could not read and write, but he had a will with an X.
mm-hmm.
And this is like early 1900s. So then it begs the question, so what's happened to this generation now where we have more education, more book sense or exposure, and yet we're not dying in a prepared way, if that makes sense. But here it was, this gentleman couldn't read and write. There's a will, there's a will, and how he transferred his land to, down to his heirs. And then unfortunately 2-3 years, not years, but generations, and now it becomes heirs property.
Mm-hmm. Do you have any suppositions or ideas about what has happened? Like, I'm thinking, are there resources out there for people to get a will? I mean, we talked about not knowing who to go to. We talked about the cost of hiring a lawyer. There's also an aspect of distrust that's going to be
Right.
within either a lawyer or within our legal system to go to the courthouse.
Right.
What do we do?
So one of the tools that we have used here is what we call a wills clinic. Literally, we enlist, with our attorneys on staff, we enlist the assistance of for-profit or pro bono attorneys and students from our local law school. And literally on a Saturday, and this is pre-COVID because it's a little different now after COVID,
Mm-hmm.
but pre-COVID, we would be in a church, in a community center, or some public building, and from like 9 a.m. in the morning to 3 o'clock, we would be drafting free simple wills for individuals. And so, it could be a project of someone's law school, to answer your question, and how people could get reduced wills. And a lot of for-profit attorneys in our state, I don't know how it is in other states, at one time they were required to do so much pro bono or provide pro bono assistance. And so anywho, so I think that's part of the option is, working with local law schools, or a local bar that is doing drafting of wills, because I know like right after 9/11, a lot of bars were doing basically wills clinics for, and I'm going to forget the name. What do you call our fire folk, police?
First responders?
Yes, yeah, they were drafting wills for first responders. So I think, so one, it could be a project of a local bar association, could be a project of a law school. So there are ways to get a will drafted if people kind of thought outside the box and created a partnership. Mm-hmm. But that's how we've done it.
Yeah, it seems like, I mean, everything you're saying, having a will is incredibly necessary to almost be like a full citizen, use the assets that you have in your favor. So I would hope that we can create more resources for people, anyone who needs that sort of help,
right.
Well,
and you posed the question, not how to stop it, but literally if everyone, as I said earlier, could have that will, the personal representative knows what the will is and what to do with the will after a person dies, that is a way to reduce the growth of heirs property.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So, I mean, this has been enlightening for me, a property or a situation I wasn't aware of until speaking to Queen Quet and then looking
right.
into it further. So I really appreciate you joining us. Do you have any closing thoughts or anything you'd like to tell our audience along the lines of heirs property or sustainability?
I think that what I've discovered is sometimes the majority groups find it hard to approach people of color. for whatever reason. But just remember, I've been around conservation groups where they had acquired easements from all the larger landowners, but what was left was a donut hole. And in that donut hole were the people of color. You know, smaller people who own smaller tracts of land have the same values for their land as those that are larger. So I would embrace building relationships with all landowners. And one of the things that I'm talking about too is oftentimes conservation groups want to do things for the community, but they need to help build the leadership capacity of the community and involve them on the conversations so that one, I'm an only child and a little independent, so I never want anybody to do stuff for me. And I think, that is, if we can empower the community to make their own decisions and really, they are environmentalists, they just don't use those large terms that are used in the mainstream. So I just think it's basically kind of get out of your comfort zone and reach out to all landowners. You would find that there's great value in doing that.
Yeah, so that's something I hadn't thought of. Can you talk a bit more on how heirs property or heirs property plays into like working with conservation groups or that they're being excluded, it sounds like?
Well, I won't say excluded. Here's a conversation that I had before we started working on our sustainable forestry program. When I would approach conservation groups about working with our landowners, now, of course, the primary tool is always a conservation easement. And then people would say, well, there's the costs outweigh the benefit because it takes just as much to, what do you do? The thing that they do every year to maintain that you're doing what you said you're going to do on the easement. I can't remember the terminology, sorry. To monitor it. It takes just as much for a 10 acre as it does for 1,000 acres. But it's interesting though how those special critters can be found on the land of those other folk that you haven't approached. So, and if you want to help preserve those critters, but for me, it's about sustainability because I think it needs to be a balance between preserving the land and helping families generate some economic value from the land that is owned. And unfortunately, because of the history of land loss among African Americans, they don't look very favorably on conservation easements. However, when we offer the sustainable forestry option, the conservation groups saw that, wow, that's a way of protecting land too. It's just not a conservation easement. So once again, I think it's just about being open and looking at different ways of doing things.
Yeah, I agree with what you're saying. The conservation movement definitely has some skeletons in its closet and some maybe archaic ways of going about.
And I'm not trying to beat anybody up because, we all have skeletons in our closet. Yeah. So just saying.
But it's something I've realized is, through my research, because I don't come from an environmentalism or conservation background. It's literally just me looking at the climate crisis and saying, right, what can I do? So I'm just trying to talk to as many people as possible, but looking into the history of the conservation movement, with the idea of protecting, but excluding all the people from the land is a little, you have to wonder what was going. Well, I think we know what was going on there, but anyway, let's
we all know, once again, you said it, I didn't.
Exactly. I said it. Fiona said it. That's it. I take responsibility from what I'm saying.
Right.
But Jenny, yeah, I'm definitely not putting words in your mouth. Please don't let me do that. And you brought up a very good point of the historical and current people wanting to come in and help, but dictating what that help is. Instead, we need to empower and listen. So
correct.
We want to encourage that. Ask the people who are already there what they want to do. Right? Any other closing thoughts, Jenny, or do we need to not go down that rabbit hole?
No, I'll just say thank you for allowing me the opportunity to talk about a plethora of things on the interview, but also, most importantly, talking about heirs property and the importance of resolving it and helping families to maximize the use of their land. So I say thank you.
Perfect. How do people follow the Heirs Property Preservation?
Wow,
And
there are many ways.
yeah. And how do we support the work that you guys are doing?
We have a website, we have a Twitter account, we have a YouTube channel, we have Instagram, Facebook, you name it. We have all of that. So how can you support us? You know, like any other nonprofit, money will work, but I also think just learning more about the issue and maybe, you know, how do you help this issue be addressed in your neck of the woods or your community. And if you're a lawyer and you're in South Carolina, you can always volunteer with us at a wills clinic, or a law student. You can volunteer. Anything else that I may be missing? I think that's about it.
Are there any big projects coming up that you want to highlight? We spoke a little bit about the African American History Museum in Charleston. Is there anything else, or is that you want to expand on that project anymore?
Well, the biggest thing for us is the fact that we turned 15 this year.
Oh, congratulations. Happy birthday. Congratulations.
And so we're planning our 15th finale. I can't get into the details, but definitely Jeff will send you, invite you to tune into that. And just, our thing is, even though we're in South Carolina, there aren't a lot of organizations across the country that are providing direct legal services for this particular issue. And for us, we've been doing it for 15 years. So we want to share what we've learned. Ideally, we would love to serve the entire state of South Carolina. And we already feel that we have a national and a regional leadership role in this issue. And so, the other option is, well, not how do we clone ourselves, but can we help? How do we replicate this model for other states who may be interested? So that's where we are now.
Excellent. Well, I'll definitely make sure to put links to the website and social media and everything in there. We will share it on our social media channels. Definitely keep us in the loop about your 15-year celebrations. It's such a shame that the Heirs Property Center is celebrating 15 years and the Gullah Geechee Nation is celebrating 20, and we're in COVID, and so everything's different, but hopefully we're adapting and still celebrating those milestones.
That the one good thing about COVID is it's made us be creative.
Yeah, and it's made, for me, it's also, as much as I can't meet with people personally, it has allowed me to connect to people like yourself and then people all over the world, because we're just a little bit more open to trying something new and getting on Zoom and talking to each other. So we'll take the wins where we get them, for sure.
Well, thank you again.
All right. Thank you, Jenny. Have a wonderful day.
Same to you.
Thank you.